Thank you very much, Bill, and especially thank you for allowing me to come here. That was a very nice introduction. Let me just tell you what you're in for. What we'll be doing tonight is I'm going to talk for 15 minutes or so about the book. Then Dr. Robert Spector, who was on the faculty at the time, is going to come up and share some of his recollections. And then we'll have what will consume at least half an hour or so is question and answer. I see lots of friendly faces in the audience, people I know, and I appreciate your coming. And I suspect people know some of this story and will have questions about it. That usually is the most interesting and fun part of the evening, so we'll leave plenty of time for that. This book is about a train wreck, not a literal train wreck, but a figurative one involving the vision of many patients at Emory years ago. As a result of this train wreck, people woke up blind and never recovered their sight. The reputations of good people on the faculty were trashed, hence the name, Waking Up Blind Lawsuits Over Eye Surgery. Now, imagine that you are a nationally known member of the eye faculty and you see your department chairman beginning to spin out of control, operating on eyes that don't have a disease, neglecting postoperative, easily detectable conditions like glaucoma, letting some of those patients go blind, billing inappropriately, and you speak up and nothing happens. Imagine you're the dean of the medical school and you're a surgeon and you see on the operative schedule way more operations than the other ophthalmologist is doing, and you know that you can't do a good job on those cases. And you start to hear complaints from patients how they drove 3 or 4 hours and spent literally a minute with this doctor. You directly order the chairman to slow down, and he doesn't do it. You speak up to your superiors, even to the president of the university, and you're told to leave him alone. He's bringing in too much money and too many good research grants. Imagine you're the pathologist in the department under the chairman who sees normal corneal buttons coming from transplants, and you know the surgery was done on someone who had no disease. You send the reports to the chairman in the chart and nothing happens. You go to the chairman of pathology and unload your problems, and he says, send it to the tissue committee, and still nothing happens. Finally, imagine that you're a poor African American from Middle Georgia sent to see this chairman. You can see well out of one eye and poorly out of another, but you have a simple life that doesn't really require good vision from both eyes to do just fine through your days. But you do have that bad eye, and he says you need surgery, so you accept that recommendation. Only he operates on the wrong eye, and you wake up the next day with terrible vision in both eyes. And then he covers it up by lying to you and tells you that he meant to do this or he changed his mind. Later, you have the bad eye operated, and still later you go blind from glaucoma that should have been detected and treated, and if it had been, he would have retained reasonably good vision for the rest of his life. This is a true story, and a very sad one that happened in the 1980s. But the final chapter wasn't written until the 1990s, when the last of 9 lawsuits were settled. The result of the chairman going down the tracks, unimpeded by warnings from his colleagues, not reined in by his superiors, was a series of train wrecks, multiple blinded eyes, 7 patient lawsuits, ruined reputations for the 2 faculty whistleblowers who correctly and courageously spoke up and then sued Emory themselves. So that, in a nutshell, is the book. There are many more details in the book, including lots of documentation, newspaper reports, ethics committee transactions, letters, diaries, depositions, details from the lawsuits, and the final settlement and outcomes. Next, I want to discuss the 3 most common questions that I get, and which probably was first on the lips of many of you, and I'll discuss those. Then we'll have Bob come up and talk, and then we can have the question and answer. The first one is, why did I write this book? Well, it's a story that needed to be told. A story for patients, to learn that no matter who you go to, if what you're told by a doctor doesn't make sense, get a second opinion. It's a lesson for doctors, not just doctors in an academic institution, but in any practice, or people actually in any business. If you see improper things going on at people at your level and you don't speak up, there is a cost to that silence. And the cost is well detailed in this book. And finally, for leaders, there's a lesson for leaders here. When you hear things about someone under your control, you need to look into it. It may be nothing, but it may be something. Another reason I wrote the story was to set the story straight. One of the whistleblowers quote in the book, Dr. David Campbell, was a good friend of mine and doing great research in glaucoma. And after he was formally reprimanded by the same ethics committee that exonerated the chairman, he left Emory and has never done anything in academic ophthalmology. He has robbed the glaucoma public of his insight and expertise. So I wanted to set the story straight. Another question is, why did I write the book now? Well, I just finished it, and it took me 10 or 11 years to do it. And it was very much a part-time project because I was practicing and doing other things. So thank goodness it's finally out. And another question is, how has it been received? Well, actually, it's been received very well. The faculty at Emory have been complimentary. I've received emails from department chairmen and others and academics all over the country thanking me for setting the story straight, for exposing this, for bringing the truth out. And it's been quite gratifying to hear what people have had to say about, thank goodness, some of this is out. And I hope in the end this will strengthen medicine. If we don't acknowledge our problems within the profession and deal with them ourselves, then one of these days somebody else will, and it won't be a pretty sight for those who are still in practice. Other people have said, well, isn't there a code of silence in medicine? Haven't you been criticized for speaking up about problems? And the answer is, I'm sure there are some doctors who are not too happy with this, but they haven't had the courage to say anything to me. So all of my responses have been favorable, and hopefully that'll stay that way. Now, it's interesting to hear some inside story about what went on. Dr. Bob Spector is a great neuro-ophthalmologist who was on the faculty as a neurologist, as well as having neuro-ophthalmology training. He wanted to speak to the Emory Ethics Committee, and they denied him the opportunity. And he finally left the faculty somewhat in disgust over all of this. And I think it would be good to hear what he has to say about this, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers.
Thanks. I think what I'd like to do is just kind of set the mood, because all of the facts that have been assembled by Tom are perfectly accurate. How many times do you read How many times do you read a book or see a movie and say to yourself, this is perfectly accurate? Not many. And reading Tom's book, he nailed it. He really did. He got all the facts straight, all the conversations that were made public. But there were a lot of private things that went on that I had some access to, and that's exactly what I want to talk about. The interactions between individuals, between small groups, and the interaction between small groups and the university officials. Understand, I was a neurologist in a department of ophthalmologists. And not only were they ophthalmologists, but they were people with huge egos, huge. They were doing excellent research. They were depending upon money. At that time, all the money for research came from the government. Specifically, it came from an organization called the National Eye Institute. Who is in charge of dispersing the funds? Dr. Dwight Cavanaugh, who was head of the Department of Ophthalmology at Emory. So there's obviously a conflict of interest. I saw people line up behind him that were better than that. They were better than that. They just depended so heavily on his funding for their professional aspirations that they didn't speak up. And that was a very discouraging thing because I had a lot of friends on the faculty, and I was upset that they didn't come clean. There were a lot of interactions between small groups and small people. For instance, David Campbell, a person who was really skewered by the Emory Ethics Committee and by the top brass, his office was right across from mine. And so he would oftentimes in the early morning or after hours say to me, I can't believe what's happening here. Dwight Kavanaugh is operating on these patients with corneal disease. They're developing very high pressures in their eye post-operatively, and I am inheriting these patients after they've gone blind. After they've gone blind, what am I going to do? I can't do anything. They should have been sent to me earlier. But the person who operated had a way of dismissing good medicine and good science. I must have had 2 or 3 fellows of Dr. Kavanaugh come into my office and close the door behind them and say, I got to talk to somebody on the faculty. And they would just kind of divulge their disappointment. They applied and were accepted at a really top-notch corneal division of an ophthalmology department. We had a great group of people, all of whom were doing good research. They were all young, they were all energetic, and we were really on the go. So you can imagine the faith that you have to have in your chairman. They really run the ship. And the ship wasn't being run in a straight line. And he did a lot of things that were just outlandish. And no matter how hard Tom makes the point in his book that Dr. Kavanaugh breached the ethics of medicine, he breached the ethics of criminal behavior. Okay? He really should have been prosecuted in civil court, not just in a medical arena, because he hurt people unnecessarily, and there's no excuse for that. Part of the Hippocratic Oath is do no harm. Well, I don't know how many times he broke that promise, because he did a lot of harm. I was a neurologist. I didn't know all the nuances of all the surgery and what the guys talked about in groups, small groups, about what he was doing and sending off tissue that came back healthy. I didn't have access to that. I was kind of an outsider, and I was young, and I had my head buried in the sand. I did attend all the faculty meetings, and more than once, these colleagues with these huge egos wanted to spend all kinds of money on equipment and research. And more than once, I got up and said, what are you, crazy? Somebody has to have a practical voice in this department. You just can't go off and travel 8 months of the year or go buy this, that, and the other thing with money that we don't have or that you're depending upon from the National Eye Institute. So they couldn't disrupt that relationship between the person who was responsible for giving out grant money and what they were doing every day in their research. And that was a real conflict of interest, a tremendous conflict of interest. So on a departmental level, there were mixed opinions. And then the department, after finding out that Dwight operated on the wrong eye, were put in charge of doing an investigation, just people within the eye department. And so they reviewed X number of charts. I mean, the mistakes were flagrant. And they pussyfooted around their conclusions. They didn't really come clean. And they should have, because these people were, on the surface, ethical, intelligent investigators who can see the paper and read it, and yet they didn't come up with conclusions that they should have. So that was a very disappointing thing. After more hullabaloo was made of it, then the Emory Clinic, the Emory faculty, formed an ethics committee. Now, this fellow, Dave Campbell, was the one who tried to appeal to the lawyers that were hired by the university, to the dean, to the president of Emory, and he was just turned away each time. So he went outside the university to gain legal help, because he was also frightened that he was going to be prosecuted because he was taking care of a lot of blind people who went blind unnecessarily. Well, as soon as Emory heard that he went outside the Klan, I'm telling you, he was a marked man. I'm surprised he didn't end up in a trunk. Really. That's really when the university was out to get him. So this ethics committee that consisted of university faculty basically came into the room that night that we met, all of us were there, and said, we find no wrongdoing by Dr. Kavanaugh, and we find Dr. Campbell guilty of being a traitor. Well, David handed in his resignation the next morning. And as Tom said, he's not been the same since. He was really devastated. So you can see on so many levels, personal, small groups, departmental, faculty of the clinic, even the president of the university, as Tom alluded to, just didn't put the proper attention on what needed to be attended to. And it was a very sad thing. He's just such a smart guy. I mean, and Tom says this in his book, Kavanaugh was the smartest person I've ever met. At faculty meetings, he spoke so eloquently. I used to tell my wife that his mother probably read him Winston Churchill as nursery rhymes. Because I was just amazed by his narration and his use of words and getting to the heart of the matter. But you know, it's obviously something comes with too much power. I'm sure we've all seen it in all kinds of professions, that when somebody gets too much power and too much money behind them, they feel they can get away with anything. And I think the best virtue of Tom's book is that he didn't get away with everything.
I'll take them in order. The president at the time was Dr. James Laney. What was the second? Was there any other thing going on at the time?
Has any similar episode happened?
Not that I know of to that degree. I think we may all remember the chairman of psychiatry from just a couple of years ago who was taking money from industry, close to $1 million, did not disclose that to the university, was giving talks in favor of the drugs produced by the companies that paid him those dollars. And so Emory did ask him to leave, and amazingly enough, as sometimes happens, he was hired by the University of Miami to be their department chairman of psychiatry. And there were some articles in the newspaper down there just a couple of weeks ago, kind of a year later, finally exposing this. So this could happen in just about any institution, not just an academic center, but it did happen here, and all the details are out. What was the third question? Could it happen again? Well, the wrong eye surgery, if it happened today, instead of there being not much of an investigation, there would be a big committee from the Joint Commission coming in as a sentinel event. There are compliance officers and compliance committees that allow people with complaints and observations to bypass senior management who might want to keep those complaints quiet. And there are quality controls, so it's less likely that it could happen today. It still could. It would take the individual that was doing the bad things and leadership willing to accommodate it, but I think it would be less likely to happen to this degree. I'm not on the faculty, so I can't be sure, but I know that they have a doctor who is in charge of quality, because I took care of his mother, and I know that was his title. And I know that, and I don't know how accessible he was, but I know that such existed, at least on paper. And I know that most places do have compliance committees, and some of this has come to the fore in the last 10 years. So I think there are safeguards, but I can't be 100% sure since I'm not really on the faculty. Well, someone came to visit this man's family. He was from Macon, but he had some relatives here in Decatur. And someone came and said to the family, your uncle was wronged. He did not intend to operate on this eye. You should sue. And that person was given a list of lawyers and chose the lawyer at the top of the list. and that lawyer filed a lawsuit. So that's how that came about. Yes, we've seen examples in all of our institutions of problems, and this is one. But you know, faculty are made up of doctors, and if you have 1,000 doctors on your staff, as Emory does, or 600 doctors, as Piedmont Hospital does, there's going to be somebody who's not doing the right thing. So it's a matter of ways of finding out and leadership dealing with these problems effectively. The AMA doesn't. Back in those days, there was no, today there's what's called a National Practitioner Data Bank, where you settle a lawsuit for over, I think it's $15,000. It's reported to the data bank. And if you go to another place, the first thing that second place does is query the National Practitioner Data Bank to see if there have been any lawsuits. And so if this happened today and he went to another hospital, the committee looking would say, well, look at here, you've got 7 lawsuits. But that was not in place back in the late 1980s when he left Emory. But he had friends in high places, and they were willing to either believe his story or overlook some of the details and take him on. Well, I answer your second question first. If someone didn't file a lawsuit, I would have no way of knowing the extent of the damage. I know from the first faculty investigation that there were a number of people who were damaged, but nobody told them, and they probably just thought well, I just had bad luck or something like that. As far as your first question, I'm quite sure there were no drugs or alcohol involved. I have a literary attorney who has told me I may not entertain psychiatric diagnoses in public because he can defend my documentation of the book, but he cannot defend my foray into being a psychiatrist. So I will have to let you read the book. Now, Bob, you may want to say something, which I cannot say.
A sociopath is defined as somebody who thinks they're doing the right thing, but in effect, they're breaking the law. And to answer the first part of your question, that it was so egregious that he ignored the high pressures in the eye that occurred after cornea surgery, he didn't ignore them. He actually told his underlings, the fellows and the technicians, to cross out the preoperative pressures and to cross out the postoperative pressures. You make a mistake, it happens to everybody. Whatever you do, you don't go back and contaminate the record and cross out things. And I think a couple of the fellows I mentioned before, they'd come into my office and say, he'd ask me to cross this out preoperatively. What do I do? I mean, these people were lucky to get into the program. They were doing so much surgery, exposed to so much pathology. For them, it was an ideal teaching situation. And then to see this, I mean, that must have been a pretty difficult thing to tolerate. But he actually had things crossed out. That's terrible.
Since a number of these patients were Medicare, Medicaid patients, was there any attempt by the federal government to investigate this on the basis of fraud?
There was a grand jury investigation and there was an FBI investigation that were alluded to in the various depositions and documents that I had. Naturally enough, any findings of those are secret and are sealed. But I can tell you the bottom line is, despite those investigations, there was no indictment or anything officially legal that went on from a criminal standpoint. You cannot bring a lawsuit in the state of Georgia unless you have a statement from an expert witness, and that expert witness now, according to the state law, has to be a practicing doctor. There are a number of doctors who spend their lives being expert witnesses and don't do a lot of practicing, but that is a requirement on paper.
Is it sometimes difficult to find somebody that's willing to testify in a case like that?
There may be trouble finding a good doctor to testify to that degree, but as I say, if you Google, or there are literally courses on being an expert witness, and there are people who are professional expert witnesses. So you'll probably be able to find somebody to say just about what you want them to say in any lawsuit situation.
Is that pretty much the way it is in most states?
I think every state requires at least one affidavit from a doctor, whether it's it used to be that whether you could be a 90-year-old retired pathologist giving an opinion about an ophthalmology case. So they've tightened some of those so that now you have to be currently practicing, and I think you have to be of the same specialty, but I'm not 100% sure on that fact.
Is there a statute of limitations involved, or might some of the people involved in the cover-up still be subject to some kind of repercussion?
I don't think there's a statute of limitations as far as malpractice goes. Now, you know, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. I'm on shaky ground answering some of these questions, but I don't know if there's a statute of limitations on fraud.
As a consumer, how am I to protect myself in my choices? I know I can get a second opinion, but how do I know about that second opinion?
Well, I mean, that's a good and a difficult question to answer. I mean, most of the time, a doctor's reputation is good enough. You have to be sure that what he says or recommends is consistent with what you think is going on or with what somebody else told you. And then you get a second opinion, you ask around, or you ask your doctor if you have faith in that doctor. I think one of the lessons of the book is that no matter who you go to or no matter how highly placed that doctor might be, you still can't put 1,000% of your faith in that doctor or really anybody. Well, there are two reasons to get a second opinion. One is sometimes the doctor wants to get another opinion because he or she is not sure him or herself. And sometimes I do ask patients, look, I want to send you to see one of my partners or even to somebody at Emory. I have a great relationship with the doctors at Emory, and I want to hear what they have to say because I honestly don't know what to do. The other reason is if the patient wants it for whatever reason. And I think if you're a good doctor, you don't discourage that, and you're happy to let a patient go see somebody, and you help out the process by sending records and all of that. There are some insecure doctors who get quite angry about it, but I think that's a warning signal right there. A doctor should be happy for you to get another opinion if you're doubtful or questioning in any form or fashion. No. First of all of these were settled out of court. And all but the wrong eye case were sealed. So I don't know what the settlement was for 6 of the 7, but I assume they were satisfactory to the plaintiffs and to the lawyers. But the man who had the wrong eye operated on eventually settled for like $4.1 million. So none of this went to a jury trial.
What was the final act that led to Dr. Kavanaugh leaving, and what has happened since he left?
He had, I think, 2 or 3 lawsuits filed, and then about the same time that the 3rd lawsuit was filed, the American Academy of Ophthalmology let Emory officials know that they were going to do an official ethics committee investigation. And at that point, he was put on a leave of absence. And then about 6 months later, the American Academy's ethics committee found that he was indeed in violation of some of the ethics. And they fashioned a kind of a settlement where he would agree not to see patients for 2 years, and he was supposed to write a letter to the doctors whom he had harmed, and he couldn't engage in any academy activities for a year. But with that adverse ruling, Emory forced a resignation. Since then, his career has flourished. He went to Georgetown for 2 years, and then left there for the University of Texas Southwestern in Dallas, where he currently is vice chairman of the department. I Googled him 3 or 4 years ago, and at that time he was not only the vice chairman, but the vice dean of the medical school and the medical director of one of their teaching hospitals. So his career, unlike the 2 whistleblowers, has been totally revised.
Thank you for being here. Very interesting information. Would Dr. Kavanaugh
He came to Emory in 1976 after a fellowship. He and I were residents together at Hopkins. He was a year ahead of me. I knew him and his family quite well, and I had no clue at that time that he was anything other than a very smart man. Then he did his fellowship in cornea at Harvard and then came to Emory right after that. So within a year or so of coming to Emory, he was the chairman. So he was mainly in training before this.
Have you sent Dr. Kavanaugh a copy of your book?
I didn't send him a copy of the book, but I did call him and the other four people in the book who don't look so good, because I knew them all, and gave them a heads up. This was about 2 years ago when I thought the book was coming out rather imminently. And I said, I want to let you know, I'm writing the book, it's about those days. If you have any comments, I'd be glad to take them and put them in the book.
Have you heard from him?
I have not heard from him, and I've not heard from any of the others, and nobody wanted to have an official comment either. Yes, sir.
Any hospital, from Emory Hospital or Mass General, and find people who are very qualified and find people that are dead wood. So it always gets me when people say, that's a great hospital, or some magazine rates hospitals. It's silly. Rate people, not hospitals.
I think part of the answer to your question is you answered it, is if you're having a bread and butter operation like a hernia, you might be better off at a community hospital where a general surgeon does these all day long, rather than at a teaching hospital where somebody does research and doesn't do them that often. On the other hand, if you're having a complicated brain operation that is only done 20 times a year by 2 people, you want to go to one of those 2 people. So you have to ask these questions, and it depends on the complexity of what you're having as to where you go and whether you decide to let someone do it or not. Yes, corneas taken from donors are judged as to the quality of the tissue. And obviously, if you're getting a cornea from a 16-year-old automobile wreck victim as opposed to a 95-year-old person who's had a lot of wear and tear in their cornea, you're going to want transplanted into your eye that of the 16-year-old because it's a lot healthier. And there were some doctors who would only use the best quality tissue and would just postpone operations. Dr. Kavanaugh was reputed to take the best tissue first and the worst tissue last. And he also operated on the more highly socioeconomically advantaged people first and the poorer people last. So the inescapable conclusion is those who operated late in the day on some occasions got marginal tissue. This man was the director of the executive MBA program at Georgia State and was my professor when I did an EMBA. No, but and I had to do a lot of writing for the various professors in my course, and it dawned on me a few years after that I really enjoyed the writing that I did when I was in my EMBA course. And that led me to an interest in writing, and then one morning I woke up and I said, well, you know, you only know one really juicy story. And so then I set about taking courses and reading and all this. I had some help from an editor, but basically I just did this on my own after I realized that I had an interest in writing. But your program was the spark. Although he's 70 years old now, and I think he's close to retirement, but he has been operating actively for the past few years. I have not. There are no bullet holes, there are no bombs in my car, and there are no lawsuits. And as I say, I've got a stack this thick of letters and emails from people all over academia thanking me for doing this. I'm sure there are people who wish I hadn't written it and thought that a doctor shouldn't write something like this, but they have not communicated with me. So everything that I've gotten has been positive. We're kind of winding down, and there will be a book signing, but if there's anything else, that's a good question, and it's a very difficult question because I guess back in the old days when there were county medical societies and people were judged to be either incompetent or unethical, the doctors kept them off the hospital staff. and they just couldn't practice or they went somewhere else. But it's the laws of this country really protect someone's ability to have a living, and that makes it difficult for people in authority to do something about dead wood. And I suspect sometimes they hide behind that and don't do what they should do. But it's not easy.
No recommendations?
Well, you do what, if you know through whatever means that somebody is incompetent or unethical and doing things they shouldn't be doing, if you're a leader, it is your duty to bite the bullet and do the hard thing and expose yourself to the just tremendous hassles of getting it done. But there are mechanisms at most hospitals for doing this. It's just there's an unwillingness to do it sometimes. And you might want to.
I would bet that in other businesses too, it's very hard to yank somebody who has tenure. It's very hard. Teachers and those professions, people who work in MARTA, they can be the worst employees in the world, but it's just hard to yank them. I think one thing that should be said is Dwight was driven by money. He wanted to build an eye center, the eye center that you see on Clifton Road. And I think that got a hold of him and his conscience. And at all costs, he was going to build that eye center for what he gathered as a faculty. And I think that was one of the overriding motivations for him to do so much surgery, even though it was illegal and unnecessary.
The lawyer who took on the man who had the wrong eye operated on knew the department because Dwight and the others correctly tried to get rid of a resident who was very marginal. And I was on the clinical faculty and teaching down at Grady every couple of weeks, and I certainly agreed that this doctor was marginal. Well, the lawyer who represented Sergeant Houston came in and successfully kept the department from being able to dismiss this resident. So they had to keep him and keep him on until he graduated. So, you know, the lawyers get in there with all due respect to your profession and make it hard to do the right thing sometimes. Yes. Most insurance companies will do that. Yeah, and sometimes they do require it.
We'll take one more question. Any thoughts to wrap up the program?
Well, 13 rather lengthy, complex operations like a corneal transplant is very unusual. There are plenty of people who say do that many cataract operations in a day because they take 10 or 15 minutes and they're not as lengthy. But today there exists a lot more emphasis on avoiding wrong site surgery. At our surgery center, we put a yes, and the patient is asked about 1 million times, are we going to operate on this eye? And I don't think that such safeguards were as important, not just at Emory, but anywhere back in the mid-1980s when this was done. You just assumed you're going to operate on the correct side. But despite all this, it still occurs, but it's much less common because we have a timeout where everybody gets in the room and you say, this is Mrs. Jones, she's here for cataract surgery on her left eye, and everybody looks at the chart and everybody agrees. We make the patient say that in the room too. So it's much harder for that to happen today than 30 years ago. Thank goodness. Thank you very much for coming.